All right, so I'm trying to keep the videos a little shorter, so I paused this one. I paused the second piece of the first video a little earlier, just to keep it shorter for you. So, as I said before, imperialism and industrialization are linked, and so I want to kind of go more into that idea. Okay, so industrialized nations are the nations that also are going to imperialize. Okay, so you've got places like the British, for example. They've got control of India at this point since the 1700s, and that grip just tightens. They use India for resources and kind of make it part of their empire. Like I said before, we're talking places like Japan, the British, the Dutch, the French, the Germans, the Russians, even the Americans. Their power in the world rises during this imperialist time and this industrial period of time with industrialization and imperialism. Spain and Portuguese, who were more like the colonizers of earlier, the early modern era, their influence in the world declines. You've got the British and the Belgians. The Belgians are prominent in Africa, especially the Belgian Congo with King Leopold. Um, there are some direct settler colonies, but not many. For example, the French in Algeria. You remember how we learned about them? France does make a settler colony in Algeria. You've also got economic imperialism. Great examples of the economic imperialism are the Opium Wars and the British influence of China. Remember, when China refused to industrialize, the British, who had industrialized, were able to finally break into China and start to kind of control China, and other European nations followed. And basically, if you remember, they carved China up, kind of like the scramble for Africa, but they call it spheres of influence. Spheres, S-P-H-E-R-E-S, of influence. So every European nation or industrialized power took a piece of China and took the resources from there. The British were the kind of leaders of this, and the French are pretty heavily involved as well. So that's one example of economic imperialism, is the Opium Wars and the British-Chinese conflicts in China. And also, you remember, there's economic imperialism in the United States by the United States in Latin America. That begins here in this time period, and it continues on through the contemporary era. So imperialism also influences the development of new nations, new states. So the United States influence expands as the United States rises to power through its industrialization in this time period. They're the ones, remember, who forced Japan to industrialize, and it turns out to be pretty good for Japan that they did that, because they become a world power, but the United States was able to force them to do that. So the United States had a heavy influence in making Japan a nation instead of an empire. So they developed a Western-style government, a bureaucracy, an economic system that made them as a nation, not an empire. And we'll talk more about nationalism in a little bit. The United States and Russia, again, emulated European kind of expansion by expanding themselves. So Russia, as you know, expands over many different times in its history. In the U.S., obviously went from the 13 colonies, and then it added other parts, like the part of the Louisiana Purchase in the southern United States, and then slowly but surely adds on, more territory as they conquer Native Americans. The U.S. actually expands at this point in the modern era too. You'll learn more about that next year in U.S. history. But as the United States expands due to its imperialist designs into the West, into the Western United States, and into Mexican territory, there is resistance. So there's the Cherokee Nation, a group of Native Americans that actually resist the U.S. government in their expansion. All right, and finally, the other thing you want to know about imperialism is it's rooted in some racial ideologies. So we've got social Darwinism, first of all, which facilitates and justifies imperialism. Social Darwinism is it kind of plays on the belief of Charles Darwin, the survival of the fittest, where the biological theory is that the fittest animals, the animals in nature who adapt to their conditions will survive. The smartest, the biggest, the best will survive. The survival of the fittest. Now you take that concept and apply it to people, and it actually justifies to Europeans that, hey, we are the best. We're able to adapt and conquer and develop technology, and we're conquering and taking over the rest of the world finally, and we're able to do this. And it's okay, and it's right, because we are the fittest race out there. And so that already adds this existing idea from the previous era that people with lighter skin are superior to those with darker skin. There's also the white man's burden that justifies imperialism at this time. Remember, the white man's burden is the idea that starts with the British, that it's kind of like the white man or Europeans are doing people of color a favor by conquering them and civilizing them, making them Christians, educating them as white people or as Europeans would be educated, bringing them European culture, changing their own native culture and changing some of their native cultural practices. That is the white man's burden. Like, essentially, it's again another way to justify imperialism, and it's a deeply racist ideology. So that's really all I want to say about imperialism. What I'd like you to do now is take a moment and write to yourself, explain how how imperialism and industrialization are linked. So how are they connected? So you pause the video, stop and write. I'm going to pause this one now, and we're going to move on to nationalism, which I'm going to detail for you.